Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and mainly your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode, Blackwater Part 3, is the thrilling conclusion of the Blackwater trilogy, where our heroine, Tanya Barrett, is forced to realize that not all monsters are the ones hiding in forgotten places. Tanya screamed and scooted away on her butt, jamming herself into the nearest corner, and the night erupted in gunfire as the men turned and targeted the creature. The muzzle flashes from their rifles gave off intermittent light, which captured the movements of the creature as it slapped out at the nearest soldier, crushing his skull with a sickening crunch. The captain shouted a command, and the deck lights clicked on, highlighting the creature as it leaped the distance to the next soldier before the first one's body had hit the deck. This time it lifted the man in the air, and the man had time to squawk in surprise before the enormous creature ripped him in half. The men continued firing, and Tanya could see the puckering of the monster's skin as it was perforated by bullets, but it didn't seem to feel them as it gracefully launched itself backwards over the railing and disappeared under the water's surface. A few of the soldiers rushed over to their two dead comrades and crouched in a ready position, aiming their guns at the spot in the water where the creature had disappeared. There was another splash and another scream as the Alpha erupted out of the water on the opposite side of the boat, clearing the railing and embedding its sharp claws into the backs of two more soldiers. They gurgled in surprise as it lifted them by their spines and again leaped into the water, dragging them into the depths. The captain was shouting orders, and the men rallied to him. He fired his rifle at the bubbles percolating on the surface, and a couple of other men shot a few times, but Tanya could see they were all becoming unhinged with fear, whipping their heads around instead. She untangled her feet from the ghillie suit and pulled it back up to her chin. She saw her camera on the deck nearby, so she picked it up. Luckily it wasn't broken, and even was still recording, but her victory was short-lived as the captain yelled another command and pointed at her.
Tally-ho!
Two men broke off, running over and pulling Tanya to her feet. They jerked the camera away from her and threw it back down on the deck. Then Frog marched her over to the decidedly smaller group of men clustered around the captain. Someone produced a rope and tied her hands tightly together. Then the captain dragged her over to the railing at the edge of the deck where the creature had last disappeared. He quickly lashed the other end to the railing and walked back to the center of the deck where the other men were huddled. They collectively turned off their lights again, and the deck lights switched off, throwing Tanya into inky darkness once again. She screeched in terror and wrenched at her binding until her chafed wrist started to bleed, but the rope knots held stubbornly. She was in a full panic, alternating between sobs of fear and screeches of inarticulate rage, cursing them with every fiber of her being one moment,
Cotton-headed ninny-muggins!
and then begging for mercy the next.
Please!
All the while expecting to feel the creature's razor-sharp claws rip into her. She kept whipping around, trying to see everywhere at once, but without her camera she only saw vague shapes in the darkness. The men ignored her, keeping their guns trained in her general direction, waiting for the Alpha to show itself. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she could barely make out the men huddled on the deck, lined up in a rough semicircle facing her. Then the boat shifted again under the heavy weight of the Alpha, and she caught a slight pale flicker of movement, just as the creature swatted one man's head clean off his shoulders, then reached out and crushed another one's like an overripe melon. The soldiers yelled and turned to fire at the monster in their midst, but it was too fast. It slammed into them, throwing, crushing, slicing, and eviscerating all of them in a few seconds. One of the men's rifle-mounted lights clicked on as it hit the deck and spun around, casting crazy shadows until it stopped, fully illuminating the creature as it turned to look at her. She tugged uselessly at the rope again as the creature stared at her. Suddenly it staggered backwards as the captain leaped forward holding a shotgun. The gun boomed over and over,
Boom, boom, boom.
shredding the Alpha's torso until it toppled over the railing. She began screaming again at the captain
Ah!
as he walked to the railing, feeding more shells into the shotgun. Then he pulled a couple of objects from his vest. She couldn't tell what they were, but he dropped them in the water, and a moment later the boat shuddered as a giant geyser of water erupted next to it with a muted thwomp sound. Grenades. The asshole was throwing grenades into the water. He rushed over to her side of the boat and chucked a few more of the grenades into the water, each one producing a whomp with a geyser. He ignored her screams and went to the back of the boat, and a second later the deck lights came back on. Tanya gasped in revulsion at the carnage.
Ugh.
There was blood and entrails everywhere. She could even see Manuel off to the side. Both his arms had been torn off. She was savagely happy about that. But then the captain was in front of her, filling her vision. He was covered in blood, but didn't seem to be injured. Apparently he'd hidden while his men were annihilated. He pulled a large knife from his vest, and she shrank back in defense, but he only slashed through the rope, holding her to the railing, then roughly pushed her towards the front of the boat. "What are you doing? We need to get out of here," she pleaded. "You killed it. We can go." The captain barked a short, humorless laugh.
Woof.
"Dead? You think he's dead? It's not dead. I don't know if it can die." Suddenly he stopped. It looked like he was thinking. Then he started pulling her toward the carnage in the middle of the boat. "But we certainly don't need you anymore. It's a shame you were killed with the rest of them." He pulled his knife as he said this last. Tanya realized he was going to cut her up and leave her with the rest of the men, making it look like she was just another casualty. He was going to get away with all of this bloodshed. Her anger returned, and she gave him a mighty shove. Her unexpected movement threw him off balance, and he stumbled, then slipped in the blood and dropped to a knee. Without thinking further, Tanya spun and sprinted to the railing. Even though her hands were still bound, she wanted to take her chances in the black water. She couldn't jump high enough to clear the railing, so she just bounced into it.
Boink.
And thrust herself over. But then she felt a hand grab her ankle, and she dangled over the edge. She looked back to see the captain pulling her back towards him. She kicked out, catching his wrist, and then she was falling. As she hit the water, her head slammed into the side of the boat, and the last thing she felt was water filling her nose and mouth as she blacked out. She came to a little while later, struggling to open her heavy eyelids. Instead of water, she seemed to be laying on her side in a damp soil. Her hands were free, so she reached up to her head to feel a large knot. It stung when she touched it, and her fingers came away coated with blood, and the side of her head was sticky with it, and it pounded painfully as she struggled to a sitting position. Her ears were ringing,
Ding, ding, ding.
but she could also hear an odd hissing noise off to her right. She shook her head to clear it and almost passed out from the pain. After a moment she tried opening her eyes all the way and looked around. She must have been out for a while because the sky had started to lighten with the new dawn. So instead of pitch blackness, she could make out the basic shapes of things. An overwhelming, damp, fishy smell hung in the air. She gave a little shriek of surprise upon seeing a trio of gray figures crouched nearby. They were motionless, their large, round eyes staring at her without blinking. They were obviously the same kind of creature as the Alpha, but with less muscle and far fewer scars. One of them, apparently the bravest of the three, crouch-walked nearer to her, stopping a few feet away. It was breathing heavily as it reached out a tentative webbed hand toward Tanya. She froze, unsure what it was going to do, but it only grazed her arm with the pad of a webbed finger, then leaped backward with a little hissing noise. The other two hissed in conjunction and continued staring at her. They seemed more curious than dangerous, so she allowed herself to relax a bit and take in her surroundings. She could hear the trickle of water nearby and saw mounds of various sizes. They appeared to be constructed of mud and leaves and grass, and as she watched, another gray humanoid emerged from one of them. This one was built differently, more pear-shaped with short, stocky arms. Rather than a vertical fin on top of the head, there were 2 rows of small dorsal fins down the back, which joined at the base of a long, thick tail like an alligator's. It spied the 3 creatures near Tanya and rushed over, hissing furiously. The 3 creatures jumped up, and Tanya could see they were only a few feet tall as they dashed away into the foliage. The older creature continued to stare at Tanya and then walked away. While it didn't have noticeably feminine features, it had a definite matronly air, and Tanya was pretty sure this was a female. Eventually, Tanya became aware of a hoarse shouting.
Nee!
She stood shakily, then began making her way towards the sound. As she walked, she passed more of the huts and was soon fascinated. It appeared to be an entire village of these amphibious beings living in the middle of the jungle. How had nobody ever heard or seen these things? She desperately wished for her camera because she knew nobody was going to ever believe this. Nevertheless, she continued walking toward the shouting. Soon she could see several of the gray figures, backs turned to her. It looked as if they were gathered in a circle, watching something, and since the shouting was getting louder,
Help me! Help me!
Tanya suspected that's what they were watching. She stopped, afraid to make contact or interact with them or touch them, but she couldn't see through the crowd, even though she could hear the words of the shouter. "Let me go, you fucking animals. I'll kill you all. I'll come back with a whole fucking army and napalm your asses." Tanya recognized the captain's voice. The creature nearest her suddenly noticed and stepped back with a startled grunt. The other creatures also noticed and faded back with a collective hiss, giving Tanya a large berth. Tanya held out her hands to show she wasn't a threat and stood still. A deep, guttural grunt silenced the crowd, and the alpha appeared on the other side of the circle. It stood at least a head taller than any of the others, and was obviously the leader as Tanya watched the crowd part further deferentially as it strode toward her. Most of the alpha's torso was covered in some kind of fungus rimmed with black ichor. It took her a moment to realize it was a poultice of some kind, and remembered the captain and the shotgun. Apparently, the fish people understood basic first aid too. It stopped a few feet away, staring at her with those disconcerting gold-rimmed, unblinking eyes. Then it turned and walked toward a small clearing. Tanya got the impression she was supposed to follow, so she rushed to catch up. As she entered the clearing, she was shocked to see the captain, naked and suspended from a rope looped over a tree branch. Under his feet was a pool of water about 6 feet across, with an occasional bubble or splash breaking the surface. More intrigued than afraid, Tanya studied the pool, trying to figure out what it was for, but then jumped as the captain shouted at her. You put them up to this, didn't you? You're their leader. I knew it. I should have killed you on sight." The man was raving, and she could see that he had numerous shallow cuts and bruises all over his body, signs that he'd been quite roughly treated. The alpha ignored the raving man, watching Tanya impassively. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do, so she ventured a few steps closer to look at the water again. Dozens of small, dark shapes darted back and forth. The captain continued to rant at her, but she tuned him out to look around at the creatures gathered. While they all looked similar to each other, there were subtle differences, and she was again amazed at her discovery of this village. Then her gaze fell on a gray figure on the ground nearby, and she recognized the first creature that Manuel and his men had killed in the jungle. Upon closer inspection, she could see the similarities in the scale markings and the vertical fin that was slightly iridescent like the alpha's. Then it all clicked into place. This was the alpha's son, apparently. She looked back at the creature, and although it was impassive, she could sense she was right. And then she stood and looked at the captain. "You killed its son. That was his family, Captain," she explained. He scoffed. "I'd kill them all if I could. When I get out of here, I'm going to drop the wrath of God on them. And you." "You don't have the authority or the right to kill them. This is an indigenous species. You have no right," Tanya flung back at him. "No right? No right? bitch, did you see what they did to my face? He's going to die for that, and I'm going to erase the rest of them from existence for ever daring to fuck with me. He glared at the Alpha. Tanya shook her head, suddenly tired. She just wanted to lay down and sleep, and her head was pounding again.
Boom, boom, boom.
She heard one of the creatures hiss softly. Then it was joined by another and another until the whole group was hissing in one long note. It was an eerie sound, and Tanya glanced around nervously. The Alpha turned and stepped over to where one of the creatures was holding the other end of the captain's binding. He took a hold of the rope and slowly released it, sliding through its palm as the captain lowered into the pool. The captain continued to shout at the Alpha for a moment until his feet were submerged ankle-deep in the pool. Then his shouts turned to screeches of pain.
Ow, 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 ow.
The Alpha pulled up the rope after a moment, raising the captain out of the water. Tanya was horrified to see most of the flesh had been stripped from the bones of his feet. The captain continued to scream as blood poured from his legs into the pool, quickly turning a dark red. He turned his one good eye toward the Alpha and began babbling incoherently. She couldn't hear all his words, but she could tell he was begging for mercy.
Please.
She glanced at the still gray form of the Alpha's murdered son and knew there would be no mercy for the captain today. The Alpha lowered the captain again, this time up to his knees, and the man screamed even louder, his anguish resonating through the jungle. And again the Alpha pulled him up, and Tanya had to look away from his fleshless legs. The pool was now murky with blood and bits of flesh. For what seemed like hours, the Alpha lowered and raised the captain in and out of the pool. The man continued to scream even after his vocal cords gave out, and somehow these soundless whispers of agony were even worse, and Tanya pressed her hands over her ears to block out the horrible sounds of his agonized gasping. At some point, the captain either passed out or died, and he stopped thrashing, but the Alpha continued raising and lowering the body until only a denuded skeleton remained. Tanya had long stopped watching. Although she didn't fault the punishment, it was simply too brutal for her to bear, and she cried softly. Hugging herself until the crowd began pressing in, she looked over to see the Alpha toss the skeleton unceremoniously onto the grass, while the rest of the creatures picked up the bones and ran off with them into various directions, scattering the captain's remains once and for all. The Alpha approached her and she stiffened, worried she would be next. But it simply pointed at a narrow path nearby, so she started walking in that direction. As she slapped at the occasional mosquito and weaved through the thick foliage, she could feel the Alpha behind her. Finally, she came to the bank of the larger river where one of the Zodiac boats had been pulled up onto the shore. She turned curiously to the Alpha, but he simply walked by her and picked up the rope tied to the front of the boat, pulling it in with him as he waded into the shallow water. Tanya splashed to the boat and climbed in. The rope at the front disappeared into the water as the Alpha dove in and began swimming, Tanya marveling at his speed as the boat skimmed the surface faster than the little motor would have been able to manage. A few minutes later, they rounded a bend in the small river, and Tanya could see the white shape of the riverboat ahead. As they approached, she could also see the cloud of flies feasting on the bodies. As she drifted up to the side, the wet rope landed in the boat with a plop, and Tanya jumped. The Alpha's head was bobbing in the water a couple feet away, staring at her. Not knowing what else to do, Tanya raised a hand in a tentative wave. The Alpha tilted its head slightly, then it was gone, with the only evidence of its existence a small trail of bubbles leading away from the boat. Nose wrinkled in disgust at the sight and smell of the massacre, she quickly retrieved her gear from the deck and threw it into the smaller craft. Meanwhile, she was thinking furiously, trying to come up with some story that would explain the loss of an entire crew of trained mercenaries and her injuries. Finally, she decided that she should just sink the boat. Remembering how the captain had thrown grenades into the water, she picked her way through the corpses, collecting several of the round explosives. But after she'd collected a few, she stopped and let out a frustrated sigh. She didn't know how to use grenades to sink a boat. All she knew was that you had to pull the pin thingy, but that was it. And she certainly didn't know how to do it without killing herself in the process. So she put the grenades back on the deck and went to where the fuel cans were stored. Uncapping one of the larger ones, she splashed gasoline all over the deck and the corpses, and then grabbed the other fuel can and emptied that as well until the entire deck was covered in the potent liquid. She searched around until she found a couple of emergency flares, then climbed into her smaller boat and shoved off, paddling several feet away before she paused to light the flare. She tossed it high over the railing and heard it hit the deck with a sizzle. Suddenly, she saw a yellow flame shoot up, and then the entire deck lit on fire with a whoomp. The sudden heat singed her hair and eyebrows, and she reached for the pull cord on the engine of her boat. But it lurched again, this time the Alpha pulling her away from the floating inferno. After about 100 yards, she turned at the sound of something exploding on the boat, and a massive ball of fire and smoke billowed into the air as it began to sink. She watched until the burning hull slid beneath the waves, taking with it all evidence of the encounter and leaving behind only a few pieces of flotsam bobbing on the surface. She moved to start the boat's engine and paused, looking at her gear. She reached down to pick up the camera she dropped on the deck. It had continued recording until it lost battery power, so she switched to a fresh battery and turned it on. By some bizarre miracle, the camera had landed right side up, aimed at the deck, and had captured all the events of the boat, including the monster's attacks and her subsequent escape into the water. It also showed what happened after she'd gone overboard. The Alpha had leaped aboard soon thereafter and slaughtered all remaining men except the captain. Then it had simply picked up the flailing man, slammed him to the deck, and then grabbed his unconscious figure and bounded back into the water. She slid the memory card out of the camera and looked at it. This tiny little card represented financial comfort for the rest of her life. All she had to do was give it to the company and cash the huge check. But while she was pondering, she noticed that strong fish odor and glanced up to see the Alpha standing waist deep in the water near the shore, watching her. She knew there was no way he could tell what she was doing or what she was thinking, but it sure seemed like he was waiting to see what she'd decide. She thought of the small village, the murdered adolescent, and the horrifying events set in motion by the greedy mercenaries, and knew she would be just as bad as them if she ever showed anyone this footage. With a sigh of resignation,
Fine.
she tossed the card into the water, followed by her cameras. The Alpha regarded her inscrutably for a moment, then tilted its head again and slid noiselessly into the water, back in the direction of his village, and she started up the boat and pointed it in the opposite direction. She'd have to come up with a pretty convincing reason why she survived while an entire team of trained soldiers was massacred and their massive boat destroyed, but she was pretty confident she could do that because she was pretty motivated. After all, she'd seen what happens when you piss off Specimen Alpha.
Whew, that was quite the ordeal, wasn't it, Dark?
In more ways than one.
So, intriguing story.
I thought so.
So what's coming up next? I hear you have another story in the works.
Yes, you hear correctly. There is another story. I'm not entirely sure it is finished, but I'm not entirely sure it's the story I want to tell.
Okay. So there may be some editing.
There may be some editing, yes.
I see.
As is the case for a lot of our stories.
Sometimes right in the middle of the story.
Right in the middle, yes. We can't just get through a story.
No.
That much is true.
Can't be that easy.
Never that easy, no. I had one idea. I don't know. Do you have any ideas for future stories?
I give you ideas all the time, and you're like, no. You just don't like my ideas.
What was the last idea you gave me?
Oh gosh, I don't remember.
I
I
know
had
you
talked
don't
about aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, aliens was one.
I didn't put the kibosh on that. We could still do aliens.
You could do like some mad scientist thing. That would be fun.
Okay.
You could do witches and demons and
I've done both.
and
Have you been here? Have you done these stories?
well, you could just do different takes on them. And what about like Land Otter Man? You could totally do one on Land Otter Man.
Land Otter Man. Well, I do have a story about like kind of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot type. Remember?
Yeah, but Land Otter Man, I mean, would be a man that looks like a land otter.
What the hell does a land otter look like?
Like a sea otter, only on land.
Okay, there's so many things wrong with that. First of
What?
all, I don't think otters live in the sea. They are freshwater creatures, first of all. Secondly, even a freshwater otter who's walking on land, nobody would be scared of that. They'd be like, oh my God, he's so cute.
If he was the size of a man, they wouldn't.
I mean, I don't know. It's still maybe.
I mean, if he was the size of a man and he was eating people like Pac-Man as he went along.
Wow.
I guess this is why you write the stories, huh?
Yeah. Just let me do that. But
you could do like the Puka or Mothman. There are just so many.
What was the other one? The Puka?
The Puka?
Puka what?
It's just Puka.
What is the Puka?
It's like an Irish demon.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can go international. We can go global with our monsters.
I think so. We could do Krampus, although we missed Christmas. So maybe next year.
We could do Krampus, yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've got aliens, and we have a land otter man. Yeah, who eats people like Pac-Man, okay. And then the Puka. Or the Puka. And
fairies.
We could do fairies. I don't know. Do I want to demonize fairies? Then aren't they supposed to be like?
I think they're more tricksters, actually. Okay. I don't know. I mean, you would have to look up the lore. Because, have to do that, you know, some people make them all cute and sweet, and some people make them kind of
I mean, when I hear fairies, I
naughty.
think of like Tinkerbell.
Well.
Not exactly threatening.
Yeah, and not really naughty.
Correct. Yeah, we have some ideas. I have an idea. Like I said, the next episode is I don't know if it's going to go the way that I want it to. So I might have to rewrite it.
But you, our listeners, can always give us story ideas.
They might be better than Land Otter Man eating people like Pac-Man. So
it's totally a thing. It happens.
Sure. No, it does not happen, ever.
You don't know.
Ever.
You don't know.
I can guarantee you that nobody has ever in the history of mankind said, oh my God, there was a man that looked like an otter and he was eating people like waka, 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 waka.
I still think it could happen.
Okay.
You have no imagination.
Well, maybe our listeners have a little more imagination. And if you'd like to hear your story idea come to life, drop us a line at Dark&Precious Storytime on Facebook or on Instagram at dark.n.precious. Or you can look at our website at darkandprecious.buzzsprout.com. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.